So there is this, it's this balancing act, and one country, two systems, it's clear that the agreement across the board is that it should be economically different. The challenge is what else goes along with that. And actually there's a sense that it should be legally different in sort of contractual ways that will make foreign businesses feel better, but not legally different in the way that would make it sort of protected for protests and things. And if you think about that, and I think this is something that is easier for Americans to understand in 2025 than it was in 2019, the biggest protests in Hong Kong were triggered by an extradition bill, which seemed on the surface like a quite kind of technical kind of thing. But the idea was that if there were legal things where you could be tried in the very different legal system on the mainland, and before the national security law, that was a totally different system, then this was a place to draw a line. So even if you say, like, is the legal system being different part of what the two systems that people agree, there it's a kind of breakdown. Yes, there should be different kinds of laws about property and contracts, but no, there shouldn't, from Beijing's point of view, right. No, there shouldn't be different kinds of laws. And many of these things had sort of Shanghai parallels. It wasn't yet a high Maoist stage where he said the factories should be run as much by the workers but they wanted to have managers stay. They wanted to have people with certain kinds of experience feel, and there was a time when Shanghai kept enough of the trappings of that people didn't leave.
I was curious, you shared, this switching gears a bit, you shared the images from the Hunger Games and the Orwell quote on one slide. In terms of the historical parallels you're drawing, are those parallels that some of the actors you're studying within these movements are drawing themselves explicitly? Or are there other kinds of historical moments they're looking back to as resources and warnings? If the 2025 film was proleptic or something, I'm trying to think about what the historical memory within the movement is.
Yeah, so what's happened particularly since 2019, the young activists in exile that I've talked to bring up Tibet as a parallel more often than with Shanghai and this is another thing to remember about, that in honor of Paul Cohen's wonderful work, another person who I met here who recently died, he talks about outcome blindness, that historians have to remember that people don't know what's going to happen next. And it matters when the story ends, that there was an early period in the early 1950s when it looked like the Dalai Lama was going to work out a modus vivendi with Beijing. And there was an idea that maybe Tibet could continue to be, they didn't exactly use one country's systems, they had something very similar to that. And the idea would be a different place, but not too different, and then that doesn't work. And this is why some people will now, there's an interest in that kind of moment. And I mentioned the Beijing Olympics, and this is an example. I've had young Hong Kongers who were very young in 2008 remember being very excited about the Olympics. And that was a time when there were calls for a boycott by Tibetans in exile, and it seemed to disconnect. And then there becomes okay, maybe we should learn more about that moment. So that's one of the historical analogies that people use. And it's not brand new. There were some Hong Kong intellectuals in the 1980s who said the deal that's being struck sounds a lot like what was offered to Tibet in an earlier time. We should be wary. But that was a more fringe kind of thing. It's moved more mainstream in the diaspora anyway.
It's really interesting. It makes me think too of what you said about the language of return or huigui on that poster versus integration, or sort of different vocabulary.